She reported her own husband missing. She already knew where he was. Disclaimer: this story is a work of fiction inspired by real themes. Names, characters, and events are fictional. She called 911 at 7:42 in the morning. Her voice was calm, completely steady. She told the dispatcher that her husband had not come home the night before, that she was worried, that he sometimes worked late but never this late. She gave his name, his age, his license plate number, the color of his car. She answered every question without a single hesitation. She even cried, near the end of the call. Just enough. What she did not tell the dispatcher, what she would not tell anyone for another 11 days, was that she already knew exactly where her husband was. She had known since the previous afternoon. She had, in fact, been the one to put him there. This is the story of Nadine Ferreira-Cross, of the 41 minutes that destroyed a marriage, and of the slow unraveling of a lie that had been assembled with more care and precision than most people ever apply to anything in their lives. To understand what happened in Caldwell, Idaho, in October of 2019, you need to understand what kind of place Caldwell is. Because Caldwell matters. The place matters, not just as a setting but as a condition. Caldwell sits at the western edge of the Treasure Valley, where the Boise River flattens out into irrigated farmland, and the mountains to the north look like they belong to someone else's sky. It's a town that grew up on agriculture: potatoes, corn, sugar beets, and then grew further on the industries that support agriculture without being exactly agricultural: supply companies, warehousing, a quiet commercial infrastructure of the kind you find in towns where people work with their hands and buy their hardware from the same two stores they've been buying it from for 30 years. By 2019, the population was somewhere around 60,000, which is large enough to have a Costco, and small enough that the cashiers at the grocery store know your first name if you've been shopping there long enough. People in Caldwell, as a general matter, knew their neighbors. They attended the same churches for generations. They had opinions about high school football that would have surprised people from larger cities. And when something bad happened, when a marriage fell apart publicly, or a business closed unexpectedly, or a person turned out not to be who everyone thought they were, the community processed it with the thorough, unhurried attention that small places bring to local catastrophe. Nothing got forgotten quickly. Everything found its way into the long record of what people understood about each other. This matters because Nadine Ferreira-Cross had been part of that record for 9 years. She had built, slowly and methodically, the kind of reputation that takes years to construct and, as it turned out, days to collapse. Nadine arrived in Caldwell in the fall of 2010, following the end of her first marriage and the beginning of a job offer she had been surprised to receive from a regional insurance company called Cascade Mutual. She was 34 years old. She had grown up in Sacramento, the younger of 2 children in a family that was not particularly close and not particularly troubled, just distant in the specific way that some families are, where the members share a house and a history without ever fully sharing themselves. Her first marriage, to a man named Trevor Ferreira, had lasted 3 years. Trevor was an electrician with a dry sense of humor and a deep affection for weekend camping. The marriage ended without particular drama, by the accounts of people who knew them, which is to say it ended in the way that many marriages end, not in a single catastrophic break, but in a long, quiet withdrawal, like water receding from a shoreline, until one day you look and realize there's nothing left. They divorced amicably. They had no children. They remained, by all accounts, civil. Trevor Ferreira would later describe Nadine to investigators simply as someone I was with for a while, and then wasn't. In Caldwell, Nadine built the second version of her life with what her friend Priscilla Montoya would later describe as a kind of deliberateness that was almost architectural. She found a house she liked and bought it outright, using a small inheritance and the proceeds from the Sacramento apartment. She planted a garden in the backyard, lavender along the fence line, roses in 3 colors, a raised bed for vegetables she would share with neighbors at the end of the summer. She joined a book club within 6 months of arriving. She volunteered at the library's reading program for 2 years before her schedule made it impossible. She was the person who remembered birthdays, who arrived at potlucks with something genuinely good, who asked follow-up questions about things you had mentioned once in passing. People liked her. Not in the overwhelming way that makes other people suspicious. but in the quiet, solid way that becomes, over time, a kind of bedrock. She met David Cross in 2014 at a fundraiser for a local youth sports league that both of them had been drafted into helping with by mutual friends. David worked in commercial plumbing supply. He was 43 at the time, recently divorced himself, the father of 2 adult children who lived in Portland, and maintained what was, by his own admission, a cordial but not close relationship with him. He was the kind of man who did not make a particularly strong first impression, and then, over the following hours of an evening, became increasingly difficult to stop talking to. He had opinions about things, not aggressive opinions, not performed opinions, but the real kind, the kind that arrive from actually having thought about something. They dated for 2 years. They married in a small ceremony in the spring of 2016, in the garden that Nadine had planted, with 12 guests and a dinner afterward at a restaurant on the main street of town, where the owner gave them a bottle of wine from his own cellar as a gift. People who attended the wedding would later describe it as uncomplicated, happy, in the particular way that second weddings can be happy when the people involved have been previously injured and have consequently brought more care than average to the attempt. She seemed lighter, Priscilla Montoya remembered. I'd known her since 2011, and she always had this quality of being just a little bit contained, like she was holding something in reserve. At the wedding, that was gone. Or I thought it was gone. The first 3 years of the marriage were, by most external appearances, good. The couple traveled occasionally, a trip to the Oregon coast in 2017, a long weekend in San Francisco the following spring. They socialized with a small circle of friends. They maintained the garden together, David expanding the vegetable beds, while Nadine extended the flower plantings along the south side of the house. They had the kind of marriage that didn't make other people feel bad about their own marriages, which is a rarer quality than it sounds. But sometime in the late spring or early summer of 2019, no one can pinpoint the exact moment, which is always the way it goes with marriages, something shifted. Priscilla Montoya noticed it first, in the way that close female friends often notice things about each other before anyone else does. The Thursday wine nights began to produce a version of Nadine that was slightly off. Not dramatically, not in a way you could easily name, but off in the way that a painting is off when one of the colors has faded slightly. She was present but somehow unavailable. She laughed at the right moments but a beat too deliberately. She asked questions but didn't always seem to be listening to the answers. Priscilla asked her once, directly, in the parking lot after a particularly quiet evening in August, whether something was wrong. Nadine had smiled with that contained quality Priscilla hadn't seen in years. "Everything's fine," she said. "I'm just tired." Priscilla drove home thinking about that word, tired. There were things you could be tired of that had nothing to do with sleep. She didn't push further. She would think about that decision for a long time afterward. What was actually happening inside the marriage in those months, the mechanics of it, the specific daily reality of life at 2241 Hawthorne Ridge Drive, would emerge only gradually in the depositions and court testimony of 2021. And the picture that emerged was complicated in the way that the interiors of troubled marriages always are, where the causes and effects become entangled and each party, given the chance to tell their version, produces a story that is simultaneously self-serving and probably, in its way, true. The financial issue was the center of it, but the financial issue had its own center, and that center was fear. Nadine Ferreira-Cross had, by the fall of 2018, developed what forensic accountants would later describe as a pattern of financial management inconsistent with her income and assets. She was earning a solid salary at Cascade Mutual. She had risen over 9 years to a senior claims management position that paid well. She had savings. She had the house paid off. There was no obvious reason from the outside for financial anxiety. But anxiety does not require obvious reasons, and Nadine had, it seemed, developed a fear that was specifically architectural in its structure. A fear of losing the stability she had built, not losing it through some catastrophic event, but losing it the way she had perhaps once lost other things, gradually, through a series of small withdrawals, until one day the account was simply empty. She had begun to accumulate a private reserve, a secondary account in her own name, into which she transferred money from the joint account in increments small enough not to be immediately visible. $50 here, $120 there. The kind of numbers that vanish into the noise of monthly expenses unless you are specifically looking for them. David had not, for the better part of a year, been specifically looking for them. He trusted her. He paid attention to the broad strokes of their finances and left the details, which Nadine had always managed, which she was professionally trained to manage, to her. But in the late summer of 2019, something caused him to look more closely. His co-worker at the supply company, a man named Pete Villanueva, had been going through his own divorce and had been talking David's ear off about finances, about what to watch for, about the ways that money in shared accounts could become complicated. It was not, by any stretch, advice aimed at David's situation, but it lodged somewhere in David's brain. And one evening in September, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and his laptop open to their joint account, David Cross looked at 2 years of transactions with fresh eyes. He found the pattern within 40 minutes. What he said to Nadine when he showed it to her, investigators would never know precisely, because there was no one else in the room. But the general shape of that confrontation, which apparently happened not once but several times, across several weeks, with escalating intensity, would be pieced together from text messages, from David's conversations with Pete Villanueva, and from Nadine's own eventual partial account. David was not, by anyone's description, a rageful man. He was confused. He felt betrayed in a specific way, not by the money itself, which was not a catastrophic sum, but by what the secrecy implied, what it said about how she saw him, what it said about how she saw their marriage. Nadine, for her part, seems to have found the confrontations unbearable in a way that had less to do with guilt than with exposure. Being seen, not the money, but the fear the money represented, made suddenly visible to someone who was supposed to believe she was solid. I think she had spent a long time constructing something very specific, Dr. Priya Chakraborty, the forensic psychiatrist who examined Nadine before the trial, would later testify. A self-image, a life, a persona of stability and reliability. And she experienced the confrontation over the finances not as a marital dispute to be resolved, but as a fundamental threat to her sense of who she was, to the architecture she had built. And when that architecture felt threatened, her response was not to repair it, it was to remove the threat. Dr. Chakraborty paused in her testimony. Then she added, "That is a profoundly disordered way of relating to the world, and it is unfortunately not always visible from the outside." On the afternoon of October 10th, 2019, 4 days before David Cross would stop at the gas station on Route 20 and buy his last bag of peanuts, Nadine Ferreira-Cross drove east on Route 20 to a stretch of county land 14 miles from the house. She had been to this land twice before, on hiking trips with David. She knew the terrain. She knew where the access roads ended and the trees began. She knew the specific stretch she was looking for, a shallow depression between two large ponderosa pines, off the main trail, screened from the access road by a ridgeline that dropped steeply on the east side. A place where, if you left something, it would take specific searching to find. She brought a long-handled spade, a pickaxe for the roots, and a pair of work gloves she had purchased, with cash, at a hardware store in Nampa the previous weekend. She worked for approximately 3 hours. The soil was hard with the beginning of the Idaho autumn, dense with pine root below the first foot, and the work would have been genuinely difficult, the kind of labor that leaves marks on the hands and the shoulders for days afterward. When she was done, the hole was 4 feet deep and 6 feet long. She covered it loosely with a tarp she weighted down with stones. She collected her tools, drove back to Caldwell, and arrived home before David returned from work. She made dinner, a pasta with the tomatoes she had grown herself and put up in jars at the end of August. They ate together. They may have talked. They may have existed in one of the silences that long-troubled marriages develop, the silences that are not comfortable, that are not the silence of people who have run out of things to say, but of people who have said too much and chosen, for one more evening, not to say any of it again. David went to bed. Nadine washed the dishes. This was October 10th. He still had 4 days. The forensic reconstruction of what happened on the evening of October 14th would take investigators several weeks to complete, and would be presented in court by Dr. Gerald Okafor, a forensic pathologist and physical evidence specialist who had spent 17 years working violent crime cases across the Pacific Northwest. The outline was this. David Cross arrived home from work at approximately 5:49 p.m. An argument began, likely within minutes of his arrival, triggered, detectives believe, by a confrontation David had initiated earlier that day via text message, a thread from that afternoon that ended with David writing simply, "We need to finish this tonight." What the finish looked like in those first minutes would never be entirely clear. What Dr. Okafor could establish from the physical evidence was the specific geography of the event. The kitchen, the cast iron skillet, a 12-inch Lodge brand piece Nadine had owned for more than a decade, which was recovered, cleaned and replaced in the cabinet, but which retained under forensic examination traces of biological material no cleaning could fully erase. The trajectory of the fall, the approximate time. David Cross died at approximately 6:30 p.m. He did not suffer long. What followed, those 41 minutes from 6:30 to 7:11 p.m., when a neighbor's motion activated porch light records Nadine backing the truck out of the driveway, is the part that investigators and forensic psychologists would spend the most time trying to understand. Not because the actions themselves were mysterious, but because of what the quality of those actions implied. Nadine did not call for help. She did not appear by any physical evidence to have sat with what had happened and wept or screamed or stood motionless with the specific paralysis that extreme trauma produces. What she did was clean. She cleaned the kitchen floor with a thoroughness that removed most but not all of the evidence. She showered. She changed her clothes. She placed David's body, he weighed 192 pounds, into the back of his own pickup truck, a physical effort that Dr. Okafor would describe as requiring significant planning, physical capability, and a level of composure that is, to say the least, extraordinary in the immediate aftermath of this kind of event. She drove 14 miles east. She removed the tarp. She completed the burial in approximately 90 minutes. Detectives estimated this based on soil disturbance and the depth of the final state of the grave. She replaced the weighted tarp over the site, drove back to Caldwell, returned the truck to the driveway, and went back inside the house. The motion-activated light on the Hargreaves porch is not sophisticated enough to distinguish one vehicle from another. It simply records that a vehicle entered the driveway at 7:11 p.m., which is consistent with when David normally returned from work. The Hargreaves were watching television with their hearing aids out. Nobody saw anything. Nadine Ferreira-Cross slept in her bed that night. Whether she slept well is something no one has ever thought to ask her. The 911 call, made at 7:42 the following morning, is 43 seconds long. It is in the public record. If you listen to it without context, if you are simply a dispatcher receiving a call about a missing spouse, there is nothing in it that registers as wrong. Nadine's voice has the particular texture of contained worry, controlled on the surface, with the pressure of something beneath it just visible enough to suggest authentic emotion. She provides David's description, his vehicle information, his last known location, with the organized precision of someone in a state of functional distress. She asks, near the end, whether she should be doing something different, whether there's anything else she can provide. The dispatcher tells her she's done everything right. She thanks him. The call ends. Detective Renata Ibanez of the Canyon County Sheriff's Office took the missing persons report in person at the house on Hawthorne Ridge Drive that same morning. Detective Ibanez had been working investigations in the Treasure Valley for 11 years, and she had developed, in that time, a specific and largely reliable sensitivity to the quality of the space around people in distress, the way the air feels different around someone who is genuinely frightened versus someone who is performing fright. She would be the first to acknowledge that this sensitivity was not infallible, that grief comes in shapes that don't look like grief. But she noted things. In her case files and later in her courtroom testimony, she described Nadine Ferreira-Cross sitting across from her at her own kitchen table. The same table, the same kitchen, composed in a way that stopped just barely short of comfortable. She was sad. She was worried. She had photographs ready, already printed, already in a folder. which Detective Ibanez noted silently as a level of preparation that could reflect either thorough concern or something else. She described David's habits with precision and apparent affection. She mentioned his children in Portland. She asked at one point what the resolution rate for missing persons cases was. What percentage resolved on their own without something bad having happened? Detective Ibanez told her the majority resolved. Nadine nodded slowly. She said, "That's good. That's something." Detective Ibanez would write in her case notes that evening, "Subject presents as cooperative, knowledgeable, composed. Slight atypicality in question resolution rates, not consistent with hope, consistent with probability assessment. Monitor." It was a thin thread, but she kept it. The first 4 days of the investigation moved in the direction that investigations of this kind typically move, outward, through David's work contacts and social circle, looking for a story that explained his absence. Pete Villanueva, his co-worker, told detectives about the financial confrontations, about the text message from October 14th. This was noted with interest, but it pointed in multiple directions simultaneously. Toward David having left voluntarily, toward a marital breakdown with David as the one who departed. Nadine, when detectives asked her about the financial situation, cried. She described it as a misunderstanding she regretted deeply, a private arrangement she should have discussed with David more openly, a lapse in communication she wished she could undo. She was convincing in the specific way that true statements, selectively offered, tend to be convincing. The money was real, the regret sounded real. Detectives noted it as a complicating factor in David's potential motivation to leave, but not as evidence of anything more serious. David's car was found on October 17th, parked on a side street 2 blocks from a bar called the Saddleback. The working theory became visible in that discovery. David had perhaps gone drinking, perhaps met someone, perhaps chosen to disappear into whatever follows the end of a marriage. The bartender at the Saddleback had no memory of him. The surveillance footage outside the bar, which covered that block, showed no footage of David's car arriving, which meant the car had been placed there either during a gap in the system or from a direction the camera didn't cover. Detectives filed this inconsistency. They did not yet understand what it meant. Nadine, told about the car, went very still. Detective Ibanez, who delivered the news in person, would describe this reaction in court with specific care. "It wasn't the stillness of surprise," she said. "Surprise breaks across a person. There's a physical response. The body registers the new information. This was different. This was the stillness of someone who has received information they already possess and must now perform receiving it for the first time." She had kept the thread. It was getting shorter. On the evening of October 19th, 5 days after the burial, 4 days after the 911 call, Nadine Ferreira-Cross drove back out to the county land on Route 20. No one has been able to establish definitively why. The various people who have studied this case, investigators, prosecutors, psychologists, the journalists who would later write about it, have all turned this question over at some length, and the answers they have arrived at are various and unsatisfying. Dr. Chakraborty, the forensic psychiatrist, suggested that Nadine may have experienced the return as a compulsive checking behavior, a feature of certain anxiety responses in which the person returns to the site of something they have done, not from guilt or sentimentality, but from a compulsion to verify that the thing is still contained, like checking that you've locked the door, but at catastrophic scale. Others have suggested simpler explanations, that she needed to see it was still covered, that something about the tarp had worried her, that she had left a tool. What is known is that Elton Burris, a retired farmer who owned the adjacent land, was walking his fence line at dusk when he saw fresh tire tracks on the access road. He noted them. He returned to his house. He forgot about them, more or less, until he read the local newspaper 4 days later and found a brief item about a missing man from Caldwell, and something in his memory shifted, quietly, into a new alignment. He called the non-emergency line on the morning of October 22nd. By the afternoon of October 23rd, Detective Ibanez had a cadaver search unit on the county land. The dogs worked the area east of the access road, in the direction of the tree line. At 11:14 a.m., the lead handler, a woman named Carol SB8, who had been doing this work for 8 years and had never, she would later say, developed a way of feeling ordinary about it, indicated the location: 2 Ponderosa Pines, a shallow depression between them. David Cross was found at 11:14 a.m. on October 23, 2019. He was identified formally by dental records. He had been there, in the ground, for 9 days. Forensic work at the site and subsequent laboratory analysis over the following 48 hours produced a body of evidence that District Attorney Miriam Osei Bonsu would later describe as both straightforward and, in one specific respect, deeply unusual. The straightforward elements: the cause of death, confirmed as blunt force trauma consistent with the cast iron skillet recovered from the Ferreira-Cross home. The biological trace evidence that connected David's death to the kitchen. The tire tracks on the access road, consistent with David's truck, which had been located and examined and found to contain trace soil evidence matching the burial site. The unusual element was the pre-dug grave. It had not been dug on the night of the 14th. The soil disturbance pattern, the tool marks on the embedded rock, the moisture content at different depths, all of it pointed to excavation done 3 to 5 days before the burial occurred. The forensic geologist who examined the site, a consultant named Dr. Yoshida from the University of Idaho, placed the digging window with reasonable certainty at October 10th through October 12th. David Cross had been alive on all of those days. On October 10th, the most likely day for the digging, he had been at work. He had sent 3 text messages and attended a staff meeting. He had picked up lunch at a sandwich place on 3rd Street, where the owner recognized him and later confirmed the visit. He had been a living, ordinary person doing ordinary things while his wife, 14 miles away, prepared a space in the ground for his remains. Detective Ibanez, reading the geologist's report, sat for a moment in her office before she stood up and walked to the window. She stood there for a while, then she turned around and began preparing the arrest warrant. Nadine Ferreira-Cross was arrested at Cascade Mutual Insurance at 2:07 p.m. on October 25, 2019. She was at her desk. She was on the phone with a client. She saw the 2 officers enter the building, and she ended the call immediately. Which one of the arresting officers, Deputy Marcus Tejada, a different Marcus Tejada than the gas station cashier, a coincidence that is simply a coincidence, would later note as another data point in what was becoming a consistent portrait of a person who processed unexpected events with unusual speed. She asked to get her coat from the chair behind her. They allowed it. She put it on with the careful deliberateness of someone who understood they were being observed. She walked with them through the office, the same office where she had spent 9 years becoming known as reliable, thorough, good at her job, without speaking. Her co-workers would later describe the particular quality of that walk, not the performance of dignity, but something quieter than that, something that looked, from the outside, like a person arriving at a destination they had perhaps known was coming for some time. She said nothing until she was in the cruiser. Then she said, to no one in particular, "I need you to call Priscilla, tell her to water the plants." The trial of Nadine Ferreira-Cross began in March of 2021, delayed by the pandemic by nearly a year and a half, which gave the people of Caldwell, and eventually a much wider audience, a long time to form and revise their opinions about what kind of person could do what she had done. It lasted 16 days. It was notable not for any particular legal drama. The physical evidence was overwhelming, the forensic chain of custody was clean, the defense had limited ammunition, but for what it produced in terms of the psychological portrait of the person at its center. 3 different expert witnesses took the stand to help the jury understand Nadine Ferreira-Cross, and the picture they assembled, taken together, was the kind that resists simplification. Dr. Anwanobi, the forensic linguistics expert, addressed the 911 call. He walked the jury through the specific patterns of language use in the recording, the way information was distributed, the precise emotional calibration, the specific question about resolution rates that Detective Ibanez had flagged in her notes on the morning of October 15th. Dr. Anwanobi described a speaker who was managing the interaction, rather than experiencing it. When people are genuinely frightened, he explained, their language production becomes degraded. They repeat themselves, they lose threads, they provide information in non-linear order. This speaker does none of those things. This speaker is tracking the conversation with full cognitive resources." He paused. "That is not what fear sounds like. That is what control sounds like." Dr. Chakraborty, testifying for the defense, offered the more complicated portrait. She described a woman whose early life had produced a specific kind of psychological architecture, an intense need for stability and self-sufficiency, built on a foundation of early experiences with abandonment and unpredictability that had never been adequately processed. She described a person who had constructed a life of remarkable deliberateness: the garden, the book club, the Thursday evenings, the carefully maintained reputation. As a kind of fortress against a terror of loss she had never articulated even to herself. She described the financial reserve Nadine had built not as predatory planning, but as a symptom of that underlying fear, the small secret preparation for a collapse that she both dreaded and at some level expected. "The question this case raises," Dr. Chakraborty said, "is not whether Nadine Ferreira-Cross is mentally ill by legal definition. The evidence is insufficient for that determination. The question is what we are looking at when we look at a person who has built a life of apparent normalcy and warmth while carrying within it a capacity for this. And the answer, which is uncomfortable, is that we are looking at a human being whose interior life diverged from her exterior presentation in ways that no one close to her was equipped to see." The prosecution's rebuttal was brisk. The pre-dug grave, they said, was not the product of dissociation, it was the product of planning. Whatever Nadine Ferreira-Cross feared, whatever she carried, the hole in the ground outside Caldwell had been dug with a specific person in mind, a person who was still alive. The jury deliberated for 2 days. They returned a verdict of guilty on the first-degree murder charge on March 29, 2021. The vote was unanimous. At sentencing, Canyon County Judge Alicia Whitfield noted the premeditation element, the staging of the missing persons call, and what she described as the extraordinary degree to which the defendant maintained her deception while allowing others, including law enforcement, to operate under a false understanding of events. She sentenced Nadine Ferreira-Cross to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. Nadine did not speak at her sentencing, as was her right. She was 45 years old. David Cross's children from his previous marriage, a son, Garrett, and a daughter, Simone, were in the courtroom for the verdict. Neither of them gave statements to the press immediately after. They had requested, through the Victim Services Coordinator, that their presence not be photographed. A court officer had enforced this with professional firmness. Garrett Cross declined all subsequent media requests. He has remained out of the public record. Simone Cross gave one interview, several months after the verdict, to a local television journalist who had covered the trial with particular care and whom Simone had come to trust. She did not say much. She talked about her father in terms that were specific and small, which is the best way to describe someone who has been lost, the kind of things that don't make it into obituaries. His terrible jokes, the way he remembered people's birthdays but always called at 11:58 p.m., right at the wire. The coffee mug he kept at work with a chip in the handle that he refused to throw away because it had been a gift from Garrett. Then she said something that the journalist, in writing up the interview, placed at the very end. "I think about him at the gas station, buying his peanuts, 3 miles from home, being exactly himself, not knowing what was already arranged. And I think about how that's the reality we're all living in, all the time. Someone could have dug that hole for any of us. We just don't know it yet. We never do." Priscilla Montoya, who testified briefly at the trial about the conversations she had had with Nadine in the weeks before the disappearance, went back to her life afterward with the thoroughness of someone who has decided, consciously or not to be defined by what happened to her friend. She still lives in Caldwell. She still hosts Thursday evenings. She has, by her own account, become more careful about what she allows herself not to notice. She gave one lengthy interview, a year after the trial, to a true crime podcast that documented the case in 5 episodes. In that interview, she returned to the conversation she had reported in court, the one in the parking lot after the September wine night, When Nadine had talked about the door inside yourself, the version of yourself you didn't know was there. I've thought about it so many times, Priscilla said, what she was really saying. And I think she was telling me something true. I think she was telling me that she had found something in herself, or was finding it, and she was frightened of it. I think some part of her wanted me to ask, to push, to say, what do you mean, what door, what are you talking about? She paused, and I laughed, because it seemed abstract, because I didn't understand that there are people for whom that question is not abstract at all, who have been standing in front of that door for a long time and watching themselves reach for the handle. Owen Dahl, David Cross's supervisor at the plumbing supply company, kept David's coffee mug on the break room shelf for 9 months after the disappearance. He has said, in the one interview he gave to the local paper in the fall of 2020, that he didn't entirely understand why he kept it, just that removing it felt like completing something that shouldn't be completed yet. Eventually, a new hire used it by mistake, and Owen didn't correct the mistake. He washed the mug afterward, placed it back, and left it there. Some things you hold on to, he said. Some things you keep in the room. Detective Renata Ibanez retired from the Canyon County Sheriff's Office in the summer of 2023, after 23 years of service. She was given a small party at the office and a plaque with her name on it that she said she would put in the garage. In one of her last interviews before retirement, a journalist asked her what the Ferreira-Cross case had taught her about people, about the gap between who we appear to be and who we are. She was quiet for longer than usual. It taught me something about the nature of control, she said finally. We think the dangerous people are the ones who've lost control, the ones who are volatile, unpredictable, whose anger is visible from the outside. And those people are dangerous, yes, but they announce themselves. You can see them coming. The other kind, she said, the kind who have decided, who have done the accounting and settled on something and then gone back to their daily life while carrying that decision around inside them, those are different. Because there's nothing to see. The surface is clean. The garden looks good. The dinner is on the table. What makes someone like Nadine Ferreira-Cross terrifying isn't the thing she did. It's the thing she contained, the distance between the outside and what was happening inside it. We can't see that distance. We can't measure it. We have no instrument for that. I looked at her across that kitchen table the morning of October 15th, and I saw someone who looked like exactly what she said she was. And she was sitting about 3 feet from where her husband had died 12 hours before. 3 feet. She looked out the window. We just don't have the instruments for that. The house at 2241 Hawthorne Ridge Drive was sold in the fall of 2020, after the estate settled, to a young couple named Torres, who had 2 children and had been looking for something on the east side of town near the Good Elementary School. They knew some of the history. You couldn't completely not know in a town that size, but they had the particular optimism of people starting out, which involves a specific willingness to believe that history is not architecture, that what happened in a place is not the same as what the place is. They replanted the garden. The raised beds that David had kept for vegetables are gone, turned under, replaced by lawn where the children play. The lavender along the fence line survived the transition and still blooms each summer in the heat. The neighbors have mostly changed. The Blum family moved to Boise. The Hargreaves couple, who were old when this happened, passed away within 6 months of each other, in the way that very long marriages sometimes end. New families on both sides. People who have no reason to think about what happened next door a few years ago. The street is quiet. It is an ordinary street in an ordinary town, and it looks exactly like what it looks like. Nothing about it would tell you anything. Which is, of course, exactly the point. There is a question that lingers at the center of this story, and it is not a legal question, and it is not a psychological question exactly, though it touches both of those. It is a more basic question than either of those. It is the question that Priscilla Montoya was asking herself in the parking lot after the September wine night, without knowing she was asking it. How much of what we think we know about the people standing right next to us is real? Not in the sense of deliberate deception, though that is certainly part of this story, but in the deeper sense of when you know someone for 7 years, when you sit across from them on Thursday evenings and share wine and tell them things about your life and hear things about theirs, When you build that kind of accumulating record of a person, what are you actually building? Is it knowledge of them, or is it a map you've drawn from the parts they've allowed you to see? Priscilla knew Nadine. She had known her for years. She knew things about her that Nadine's co-workers didn't know. Things about her first marriage, things about her family, things about the small daily texture of her private life. She knew her well enough to notice when she seemed off, well enough to ask the question in the parking lot, well enough to hear the strange thing she said about the door, and she still didn't see it. Still couldn't see it. Not because she wasn't paying attention, but because what was behind that door was not accessible from the outside. It never had been. The distance between the surface and what the surface was covering had always been there. They had just been on the side of the surface that felt like the whole thing. There is one final detail. It comes from Dr. Chakraborty's testimony, buried in the middle of a long technical passage about dissociative response patterns, easy to miss if you are not specifically listening for it. Dr. Chakraborty described a moment from one of her 6 sessions with Nadine during the evaluation period before the trial. She described asking Nadine what she had felt, not thought, not decided, but felt, on the afternoon of October 10th, when she drove out to the county land with her spade and her gloves and her tarp, and prepared the place where her husband would eventually be buried. Nadine had been quiet for a while. Then she had said, "I felt calm. I felt like I was solving something, like there was a problem that had been pressing against me from the inside, and I was finally doing something about it. It felt like relief." She had paused, and then she had said very quietly, "And then I drove home and made the pasta with the tomatoes from the garden. And it was good. It was a good dinner." Dr. Chakraborty had not included this quote to be dramatic. She had included it to make a clinical point about the disconnection between affect and action in individuals with certain psychological profiles. It was a clinical point. It was meant to be read clinically. But it is the thing that stays with you after everything else in this story has been processed and filed and put away in whatever part of your mind this kind of story lives in. Not the crime, not the investigation, not the verdict. The pasta with the tomatoes from the garden, the good dinner, the 2 people sitting down to eat it across from each other on an October evening in Caldwell, Idaho. One of them had spent 3 hours that afternoon with a spade in the ground. One of them didn't know. One of them would never know. One of them had 4 days left. The pasta was good. The candles were lit. They talked about ordinary things. That gap, that cold, invisible, immeasurable gap between what we sit across from and what is actually there, is the thing that none of us, no matter how closely we look, no matter how long we have known each other, no matter how careful we are, can ever entirely close. And that gap, that specific gap, is where the strange, dark, and mysterious lives, right there at the table, right there across from you. Every time,